As always, thank you for joining us at the Delaware Public Archives for our first Saturday program for December. Thank you all for coming out on this lovely, sunny, warm day. And of course, while you're here, after we're done with the program, we always encourage you to go and visit our friends at First State Heritage Park. So today we're going to be taking a look at the turbulent world of revolutionary politics in Delaware. Delaware had passionate populations of both Whigs and Tories. Both of them were very active throughout the Revolutionary War. We're joined today by a guest speaker, none other than Dr. Bruce Bendler from the University of Delaware, who above all else is also an esteemed researcher here at the Delaware Public Archives. So without any further ado, I'll welcome Dr. Bendler.
Oh, good morning, and thank you for that introduction. I should add that next year will be my 50th year of doing research here at the Delaware Public Archives. I first started in 1976, the bicentennial year, and I'm still around for the, if I say this correctly, the semi-quincentennial. I'm grateful for all of those years, and I'm grateful to the Delaware Public Archives for having such a wonderful facility here and just having such a rich collection of documents related to Delaware's history. Yes, I will be looking at the turbulent politics in Delaware during the Revolutionary era, and I'm going to focus on two individuals down in Sussex County, William Peery and Boaz Manlove. William Peery was a staunch patriot. Boaz Manlove was a strong loyalist. And maybe full disclosure is necessary here as well that I am not a direct descendant, but I'm kind of a collateral descendant of Boaz Manlove. I haven't got all the family connections together, but good solid evidence indicates that I'm a descendant of one of Boaz Manlove's brothers. Maybe that's not the right thing to say when we're celebrating 250 years of independence, but historical facts are historical facts. They cannot be changed. So what I'm going to do is look first at the career of William Peery, how he kind of surmounted a good many adverse conditions in strongly loyalist Sussex County. Then we will go over to the career of Boaz Manlove and how he was in time forced to flee the county when the pro-patriot faction down there in Sussex County assumed control. So beginning with William Peery, when the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence on July the 4th, 1776, Sussex County had already become a hotbed of opposition to that decision. The county's political leaders had, for the most part, supported the protest against British encroachments on American liberties up to about 1774. They protested the taxes levied in the 1760s. They also supported the efforts to send delegates to the First Continental Congress in September of 1774, but when independence became the issue, Sussex Countyans began to question the wisdom of that decision. And indeed, there was no such thing as scientific polling back then, and I'm not sure that scientific polling is always all that scientific even today, but if there had been any kind of polling, a popular referendum or anything of that nature, Sussex County would have surely voted, rather overwhelmingly, against independence. So patriot leaders in Sussex County had to swim against a rather strong political tide. And William Peery was one of those. He was evidently a good swimmer, and he swam against that tide. He was a farmer, a sawmill operator. He was a lawyer. He lived in Broadkill 100, not too far north, or northwest, I should say, of Rehoboth Beach. And he became both a politician and a military officer as well. His strong support for independence And his opposition to the dominant Loyalist faction in Sussex County did not win him too many friends down there. Only with the support of state leaders such as Caesar Rodney, among a good many others, was Peery able to overcome the Loyalist dominance of Sussex County, and eventually Peery and his political allies gained control of Sussex County politics and began efforts to suppress the Loyalists, with not so favorable consequences, by the way, for Boaz Manlove. Before the tumult of the war years, Peery had acquired land and had solidified his economic position in Sussex County. Starting in the 1760s, he had purchased several tracts of land, indeed over 500 acres, in the Cool Spring area along the tributaries of the Broadkill River. Some of his land was strategically located along the county road to Lewis, near which Peery had built a sawmill. Peery also practiced law, affording him opportunities to establish those political connections as well. But by 1775, he had firmly attached himself to the political faction in Sussex County that advocated vigorous opposition to British encroachments on American liberties. And when many of those who up to that time had supported the protest movement balked at that idea of independence, I suppose it would have been considered the I word in Sussex County or something like that, Peery and his political allies found themselves in a rather perilous political position. Peery's close ally, Henry Fisher, described that political peril in a letter he wrote to the Pennsylvania Council of Safety on the 25th of October, 1776, just a few months after independence. Marked to the attention of Thomas McCain, and Thomas McCain was involved in both Delaware as well as Pennsylvania politics, and with the attainment of independence, the executives of Delaware and Pennsylvania were separated. They had been combined up until the 4th of July, 1776. But he marked this letter to the attention of Thomas McCain. Fisher described the few friends of America in the county as almost worn out with the political contention. Furthermore, disaffection with the common sense of America, kind of a play on Thomas Paine's title there, had not been equaled by any transaction on the continent since the commencement of the present dispute with Great Britain. Not content with electing their favored slate of candidates to the General Assembly in the first elections after independence in October 1776, Tories or Loyalists also cut down the Liberty Pole. They shouted huzzas to King George III and lauded General William Howe's conquest of New York, accomplished just a month or two before. William Peery had commenced his military service by September 16, 1775. He then served as a standard bearer in the company commanded by David Paul, who was certainly one of the greatest Loyalists or greatest patriots of Sussex County, and later would become governor of the state. He quickly moved up through the ranks. By December of 1776, Peery was serving as a captain in an independent company, receiving a formal commission to that rank nearly a year later. Commission stated the company's mission for the safeguard of the pilots and the persons and goods of well-affected subjects of the state residing near the town of Lewis and the coast of the Delaware Bay. The main purpose here is to protect those who were the river and bay pilots and ensure that their efforts wouldn't be hampered by the sizable number of Loyalists in Sussex County. Aware of the extent of opposition to the American cause in Sussex County, Peery and his political ally, again Henry Fisher, sent a report to John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress, June 2nd, 1777. The report pointed out three pressing problems in the Lewis area. First, there was a great necessity for a guard to be continuously available. Second, American ships of war could not lie safely in the road, that is the harbor area, without a military guard. Third, Peery and Fisher hoped that Congress might continue the company under Peary's command for either 3 years or to the end of the war, I guess, whichever came first. They also, they also requested reimbursement, having paid for recruiting efforts out of their own pockets. 3 weeks later, Peery and Fisher, along with David Hall and John Clowes, again wrote Hancock. They pointed out that the already bad situation had gotten even worse. The Royal Navy operated with impunity just off the Delaware coast. 60 men from the upper part of the county had boarded the Royal Navy's warships. Such unjustifiable practices continued despite an act by the Delaware General Assembly enacted the previous February, forbidding aid, comfort, and subsistence to the enemy. To add to these difficulties, an unspecified scheme had been discovered carrying on by some of the wretched junto here. When they're talking about the wretched junto, they're talking about the dominant Tory faction in Sussex County. Under Delaware's first state constitution, hastily written and adopted in the fall of 1776, the annual election day fell on the first Monday in October, a continuation of colonial practices. Given the clear majority of disaffected, as they were known in Sussex County, the results that year did not please those leading the war effort against Britain, and Sussex County had elected a slate of legislators lukewarm at best, and probably not even that, to the American cause. Political prospects for 1777 didn't look a whole lot better. Indeed, they might have been even worse. Indeed, as election day approached, William Peery had nothing but bad news to convey to Caesar Rodney, which he did on October 3rd, 1777. Tories and their allies circulated vicious stories to influence the minds of the vicious multitude here. Word vicious had a bit of a different meaning back then, really connected with its root word of vice, and to patriots, Tories were, of course, loaded with vice, or then therefore vicious. A few Whigs sought the county sheriff's assistance in administering oaths of allegiance, resulting in a threat to the sheriff to be thrown neck and heels if he tendered any such oath. You can imagine the position of that poor old sheriff. Peery also informed Rodney that he and two of his political allies had gotten themselves into a scuffle with Tory sympathizers Jacob Moore and John Wilkbank. Moore asserted that if the inspector of the election attempted to administer the oath of allegiance, he would find 150 men to take action against him. Not specifying what that action would be, but we can assume that it wasn't all that pretty. Peery and his fellow Whigs resisted Moore, determined that no man shall vote without having taken that oath of allegiance. Enclosed with this letter to Rodney was Peery's warning to the sheriff, which insisted that the election would be conducted only according to law, or Peery would, quoting here, Peery would make Lewis too hot for every Tory in it. A follow-up letter to Rodney, hastily written the same day, reported that the election could not proceed because of the threats and ensuing chaos. Isaac Bradley and other Tory leaders seized Peery's political ally Henry Fisher, attempting to beat him with their fists and with clubs. Prompt action of the Patriot militia rescued Major Fisher, but the election broke up in confusion. Peery justified his actions, claiming that he would stand justified in the judgment of every friend to the American cause. 2 days later, October 5th, 1777, Peery informed Rodney of another major problem, just one problem after the other. 36 sail of the enemy ships went past this town, Lewis, up the bay, and 47 more were seen from the lighthouse. Writing at 9 o'clock in the evening, Peery, who knew full well that the United States did not have the means to stop the Royal Navy, hoped only that they will pass without visiting us. Remember, this is about the time that the British occupied Philadelphia, and British are trying to gain and secure control of the Delaware estuary to cement their control of Philadelphia. Even so, Peery took necessary precautions. Smaller boats on Lewis Creek were brought up to the nearby fort to prevent anyone from going off to the British ships. Peery also sought orders from Rodney regarding the placement of guards at the homes of suspected Loyalists. Sussex County did not hold that general election in October 1777. Indeed, it was not held until March the 2nd, 1778. A week later, after that, the Sussex County Sheriff sent the returns to the legislature, certifying the election of William Peery, Simon Collett, Levin Derrickson, Joseph Hall, George Adams, Nathaniel Waples, and John Collins, all of whom were at least somewhat in the Patriot camp. Whigs now controlled Delaware's legislature for the first time since independence, after its dominance by men lukewarm at best to the cause of those who were elected back in October of 1776. Upon taking office, Peery, along with the rest of Sussex County's now more pro-patriot delegation, signed a letter to George Reed, who at that time was the acting president of the state of Delaware, Delaware's first constitution, entitled the Chief Executive President rather than Governor, requesting a 10-day adjournment of the General Assembly. The Council and Assembly members from Sussex argued that no method will so effectually beat down and curb the spirit of disaffection than taking up a few of their principles and disarming the rest. So they were asking Acting President Reed to empower General John Dagworthy to accomplish this mission. Reed refused the request, arguing that the General Assembly had much important business to complete, including electing a new president and arranging for the release of the incumbent president, John McKinley, from British captivity. When the British had occupied Wilmington, they captured the first elected president of Delaware, John McKinley. Other business before the General Assembly included the case of Thomas White, a suspected Loyalist from Kent County. Soon after being seated in the Assembly, Peery supported efforts backed by the state's newly elected president, Caesar Rodney, to bring White back to Delaware, rather than leaving him in the custody of General William Smallwood, the commander of the Maryland Continentals, who had captured him. According to Rodney, White himself was ready and willing to answer any charge alleged against him before a Delaware court, and White did clear his name sufficiently to go on to serve in the legislature and other state offices as well, the judiciary. In 1778, the General Assembly passed an act of free pardon and oblivion, allowing most Loyalists and their sympathizers to affirm their allegiance by swearing an oath to the new nation, but it specifically exempted 46 from any type of pardon whatsoever and confiscated their real and personal property as well. In Sussex County, Peery's political ally Levin Derrickson won an appointment to the position of the Commissioner of Confiscated Estates. He would be the one who would seize the estates of these Loyalists exempted from any pardon whatsoever and, in essence, make it state property and put it up for public sale. Peery then found himself embroiled in a controversy. Peery then found himself embroiled in the controversy of another contested election in the fall of 1778. So the 1777 election was delayed from October to March, and now they're going to try to hold an election on its regular date in October. Earlier that year, Peery and his political allies had gained the upper hand politically, but opposition in Sussex County remained intense. Thus, they still sought to prevent their opponents from voting. Peery and his political ally, Nathaniel Waples, debated the efficacy of posting guards along the road leading to Lewis. And back in those days, if you wanted to vote, you had to go to the county seat, which at that time was Lewis, and where it would remain until 1791. Waples also wanted to guard the homes of suspected Loyalists, Rhodes Shankland and Phillips Collick. Peery took a less confrontational approach, opposing such measures, evidently hoping that the Whigs or Patriots could win the election without this blatant form of intimidation. Waples' more confrontational approach prevailed, giving Peery's opponents reason to complain. When the legislature elected in October 1778 convened, it considered petitions bearing 50 signatures. The petitioners claimed that they faced intimidation when they arrived at the courthouse in Lewis to cast their ballots. Armed men standing at the courthouse demanding a sight of the votes blocked the entryway to anyone inclined to vote against the Whig candidates, Peery and his allies. The petitioners also claimed that armed guards on the roads to Lewis prevented others from even completing their journey to the county seat for the purpose of voting. Nathaniel Waples had indeed played an important role in perpetrating this campaign of intimidation, according to one of the petitions. Waples had a very considerable hand in promoting the disturbance and riot which happened on the said day of election, responsible for the armed guards on the roads to Lewis and preventing local magistrates from suppressing the riot and tumult. Concluding their complaints, the petitioners called upon the General Assembly to investigate these allegations. Whigs did retain control of Sussex County's delegation to the General Assembly, and the election return stood, but only after the presentation and hearing of objections thereto. The council then was the upper chamber of the Assembly, known as the State Senate today, of course, but its Committee on Elections and Privileges heard testimony from a number of witnesses. Thomas Collins of Kent County, the Speaker of the Council, ordered Thomas Wilds, the Sergeant-at-Arms, to summon 14 men to testify and declare all such matters and things as they shall know or be examined touching the petition, complaining of undue influence used at the general election held on the first day of October. After hearing all the evidence, all the testimony, the legislature did seat the Whigs elected from Sussex County. After his election in 1778, Peery served 2 more terms in Delaware's House of Assembly, now known as the House of Representatives. He continued to focus on supplying Delaware's militia and its regiment in the Continental Army. Peery led efforts to ensure that Thomas Rodney, Caesar's brother, be reimbursed for $7,500, and dollars and pounds were kind of used interchangeably back then, that he had spent on providing uniforms for his militia company. Even after leaving the legislature, Peery continued his efforts on behalf of the military. In November 1782, the legislature appointed Peery to settle accounts between the state and the Confederation governments. And by this time, the Articles of Confederation was basically the first constitution of the United States. 8 months later, the General Assembly approved a resolution authorizing the state treasurer to reimburse Peery £75, now we're going back to pounds instead of dollars, for having settled those accounts. After the war, Peery continued his political activity in Sussex County and beyond. He served briefly in the Confederation Congress in 1784. Evidently, just having attended maybe 1 or 2 of the sessions, he was appointed to a committee to negotiate with Native American nations, but he evidently did not, I think it was, go down to South Carolina to conduct those negotiations. And back home in Sussex County, he sought to mediate the political strife in Sussex County that threatened to delay elections for delegates to the state convention to ratify the U.S. Constitution, which all political factions supported. A little bit beyond the scope of my paper, but in 1787, there was a big dispute over electing delegates to Delaware's ratifying convention. Ironically, both sides supported the Constitution, so it was resolved in a way that Delaware could indeed become the first state. In the early 1790s, when the first party system at the national level was forming, Peery affiliated with the Democratic Republican Party, opposing Delaware's emergence as a Federalist stronghold. Again, Peery found himself in a political minority in Sussex County, which became a bastion of Federalist strength. I've often said that Sussex County was, from the 1790s up to the early 1820s, almost devoutly and religiously Federalist. Through the turmoil of war and political strife, William Peery did not neglect his personal affairs. Over the years, he had enlarged his real estate holdings in Broadkill 100 near Cool Spring. Around 1800, Peery paid taxes on 6 tracts of land, a total of 1,347 acres. And that specific number, by the way, won't be on your exam. In addition, he enslaved 6 people, 2 men and 4 boys. He also paid taxes on a sawmill on his property. Peery unfortunately did not live long after this assessment. He died December 17, 1800, and was buried in the cemetery of the Cool Spring Presbyterian Church. In his will, he divided his estate between his widow Margaret and 2 adopted sons. Befitting his profession, Peery left a sizable collection of legal works, including commentaries by the great English scholars Coke, Blackstone, and Wilson. His legal works also included 2 volumes of English statutes, a treatise on copyholds, and an abridgment of statutes. Evidently a devout Presbyterian, Peery also owned a Bible, 2 psalters or hymn books in which the Psalms were put to music and sung, and a collection of sermons, also a book written in Greek, probably the New Testament. I'm sure the appraisers of the inventory probably didn't know any Greek whatsoever, so they wouldn't know one Greek work from another, but most likely it was the Greek New Testament. Peery also owned a work by the Scottish historian William Robertson, perhaps his History of America. And he also owned a collection of pamphlets which surely dealt with the big political issues of that time, and it's possible, I don't have documentation, that he himself wrote some of those pamphlets. In all, the appraisers of Peery's estate valued his personal property at over 900 pounds. Even as late as 1800, they were still using pounds, shillings, and pence. Early in his political career, William Peery joined the opposition to British policies perceived as oppressive. Such opposition, at first, won nearly unanimous support in Sussex County, but when that I word began to emerge, independence, Sussex Countyans began to back off a little bit, and as we said, the majority of them became Loyalists. Even so, Peery did not flinch from offering personal and public support to the cause of independence, and like I said before, kind of swimming against the tide of public opinion down in the state's southernmost county. Even so, the conflict between Whigs and Tories that dominated Sussex politics continued to shape political discourse in the county. And you can see it in newspaper articles, petitions, and so forth, well, even into the 1790s, and perhaps even into the early 1800s as well. But William Peery clearly gave voice to the minority of Sussex Countyans who did not wish to remain under the sovereignty of His Majesty George III. Years later, he again found himself in the minority when the first party system emerged, supporting the Jeffersonian Party against the Federalist, and thus becoming a part of the minority in Sussex County politics. But throughout his political career, William Peery was compelled to defend causes which were clearly and almost overwhelmingly unpopular in his own county. So we moved from William Peery to my distant cousin, maybe my distant uncle, Boaz Manlove. I'm always tempted to refer to him as dear old Uncle Boaz or something like that, but I still need further documentation. So again, we go back to the early to mid-1770s, when 13 of Great Britain's North American colonies declared independence in 1776. The colonists did not act with unanimity. A sizable number of them remained loyal to the king, and one such loyalist was Boaz Manlove of Sussex County. Manlove made his opposition to independence known by early 1776 and was forced to flee from his home. And we'll get into more detail about that in a few moments. After a harrowing escape, Boaz Manlove boarded the British man-of-war Preston on March the 12th, 1777. A few days later, he arrived safely in British-occupied New York City. His narrow escape ended a political career in which he had voiced opposition to the more radical or the more pro-independence elements in Delaware politics, revealing his own, one could call it a conservative mindset, although I remind you that maybe the terms conservative, radical, and so forth had rather different meanings from what they do in 21st century political discourse. Boaz Manlove descended from families who had lived on the Delmarva Peninsula for over a century by the time he got into politics. And he had become moderately wealthy. His father, Manuel Manlove, had died in Sussex County in 1743, leaving sizable landholdings to Boaz and his two brothers, Jonathan and Manuel. His mother, Magdalene, was the daughter of Ephraim and Elizabeth Williams Polk. Although some of Manuel Manlove's property was in the area contested by the Penn and Calvert families, that boundary dispute which just dragged on until the 1770s, Boaz Manlove inherited property, land which was indisputably within Sussex County and Cedar Creek and Broadkill hundreds. He also purchased 113 acres of land on the north side of the Broadkill Creek in 1766. And a few months later, he sold a tract of 300 acres known as the Golden Field, owned by the Manlove family for at least several generations. And so he was involved in a good many real estate transactions back and forth, but all of those transactions presumably took place in the part of Sussex County which was, well, indisputably Delaware. After serving 3 years as Sussex County Sheriff from 1768 to 1771, Boaz Manlove won election to the Assembly of the Three Lower Counties in 1773. And throughout the colonial period, what is now the state of Delaware was referred to as the Three Lower Counties. It was under the executive rule of Pennsylvania, but had received its own legislature way back in 1704. And he was re-elected to two more terms in 1774 and 75. In the spring of 1774, members of the Assembly united to oppose the British response to the Boston Tea Party. In response to that event, Parliament had passed the Coercive Acts directed specifically against the colony of Massachusetts Bay. If the British intended to isolate the Massachusetts colony from the other colonies, well, they were dead wrong. The efforts failed. Indeed, British efforts led to greater colonial unity, which culminated in the First Continental Congress, which convened in September of 1774. So how did Delaware respond to this? Late spring of 1774, Caesar Rodney, who was the Speaker of the Assembly at this time, sent out a circular letter to committees of correspondence which met in all three of Delaware's counties. These committees then called upon the members of the Assembly from their counties to meet in an extra legal session in Newcastle, then the colonial capital, to adopt resolutions protesting British actions against Boston, and to appoint delegates to a Congress of Deputies to provide relief for our suffering brethren, secure our rights and liberties, and to reestablish peace and harmony on a constitutional foundation. The Assembly met in that extra legal session on the 1st of August, 1774. To bring this about, the Sussex County Committee met in Lewis on July 23rd, 1774. 13 committee members representing the differing political factions down in Sussex County got together on this issue and unanimously decided to support Speaker Rodney's summons. Boaz Manlove was one of the 13 committee members. As a sitting member of the Assembly, he then journeyed from Lewis to Newcastle to attend that extraordinary extra-legal meeting. After deliberations, the convention, as it styled itself, named Caesar Rodney, George Reed, and Thomas McCain to serve as Delaware's delegation in the Congress in Philadelphia. In my classes at the university, I always referred to Reed, Rodney, and McCain as the big three of Delaware politics through these years. Manlove won election to a second term in the Assembly in October of 1774, and as we pointed out, a third term in October 1775. In that third term, Manlove turned his attention to financial matters. Since 1723, Delaware's government had issued paper currency to provide a much-needed circulating medium of exchange. Backed by the value of real estate loans, currency issued by the three-county loan office reliably held its value with little depreciation. On September 2nd, 1775, the Assembly appointed Thomas McCain, Thomas Collins, and Boaz Manlove to consider what allowance shall be made to the gentlemen appointed to audit and settle the accounts of the several loan offices of this government. And that same day, the committee recommended reimbursement for those who they were called the trustees of the loan office, but they were given reimbursement for their efforts. And maybe just a little more on paper currency. As we all know, paper currency issued without any type of backing whatsoever can rapidly depreciate, resulting sometimes in ruinous inflation, but Delaware's loan office was fairly responsible about these matters throughout the colonial period. But it was Manlove's involvement in financial matters that revealed his disaffection from the protest movement against Great Britain. Again, on September 2nd, 1775, the Assembly authorized the issuance of another 30,000 pounds in paper money. The new issuance was to be dated January the 1st, 1776. The act authorized John McKinley of Newcastle County, Thomas Collins of Kent County, and Boaz Manlove of Sussex to sign the currency. In the end, Manlove signed only 5,500 of his allotment of 10,000 pounds. So what happened to the rest of it? At some point in late 1775 or early 1776, Boaz Manlove decided to disassociate himself from the colonial cause and affirm his loyalty to George III and the British government. Thomas Paine published Common Sense in January of 1776, setting forth a strong case for and boosting support for independence. In the months thereafter, Delaware's Assembly acted more independently of the authority of Governor John Penn of Pennsylvania up in Philadelphia, the colony's nominal executive. On June 15, 1776, the Assembly formally severed its connections to British and proprietary authority. And that's why on every June 15th, or a Saturday near there too, we observe Separation Day up in Newcastle. But Boaz Manlove was strongly in opposition to any of these measures. Thus, by June of 1776, Boaz Manlove had fled across the line to Somerset County in Maryland. On September 14, 1776, the convention elected to frame a constitution for the independent Delaware state, as it's now known, began its proceedings. The delegates learned that Boaz Manlove had just signed only 5,500 of those 10,000 pounds. Needless to say, they wanted to find out what happened to the rest of it. Considerable loss had accrued to the public by this neglect. The convention, which had temporarily assumed legislative powers, appointed James Sykes of Kent County to sign the notes left unsigned by Manlove. On November 8th, 1776, the First General Assembly, formally elected under the Constitution of 1776, ordered the Speaker to issue his summons to require the appearance of Boaz Manlove before this House in Newcastle by January the 10th, 1777. The summons required Manlove to account for the public money put into his hands as one of the signers thereof, and further to answer for other such matters and things as shall then and there be objected against him, that is, his loyalism to Great Britain. Boaz Manlove, maybe understandably, did not respond to this summons and did not appear before the Assembly as ordered by the Speaker. Indeed, on the day after the deadline stated in the summons, the Clerk of the Assembly noted Manlove's noncompliance, and the House ordered his arrest, bringing him in safe custody before this House with the utmost speed and secrecy. The resolution to carry this out, in spite of the lukewarmness to independence by that first Delaware Assembly, passed without dissent. The House again ordered the arrest of Manlove and his fellow Loyalist Thomas Robinson, also of Sussex County, on February the 20th, 1777. Robinson had served with Manlove in the Assembly even before independence and had held a number of county offices as well. The Assembly followed this action with a bill to recover the currency that Manlove had not signed or returned to the authorities. The bill quickly passed both houses of the General Assembly, becoming law the next day. Back then, a law passed by both houses of the General Assembly did not require the governor's signature. Facing certain arrest and possible charges of treason, Boaz Manlove went into hiding. On January the 11th, 1777, John Ferdinand Dalziel Smythe, that is his name, John Ferdinand Dalziel Smythe, a loyalist who had organized resistance to the American cause. Years later, he wrote a memoir. In that memoir, he wrote that both Manlove and Thomas Robinson, two of the first gentlemen of property and interest in Sussex County, were with us, having been driven from their houses to avoid the persecution, as Smythe put it, of the rebels. Smythe made it his top priority to enable Manlove, Robinson, and other loyalists to escape to British-occupied New York. Smythe wrote a more comprehensive account of his travails, including his assistance to Delaware Loyalists in 1784. In early 1777, Loyalists in Sussex County, as well as Worcester and Somerset counties in Maryland, were eager to start an uprising against shaky Patriot authority in southern Delaware and some counties on the eastern shore of Maryland. Smythe discouraged such efforts without proper and effective British support, fearing danger for, quoting Smythe here, His Majesty's interest on this side of the Chesapeake, that is the eastern shore. At Smythe's urging, the Loyalists did disperse by February 16, 1777, calling potential hostilities, at least for the time being. Even so, Smythe and those in hiding with him could not rest easy. They faced continuous danger. One night in particular, probably in late February, Their hiding place was surrounded. Fearing an attack by the rebels, as Smythe referred to them, Smythe learned that this time the attackers were actually sympathizers, including Boaz Manlove's brother Jonathan, who furnished intelligence about the rebels, where they were and how the Manlove, Robinson, and the other Loyalists could effectively remain in hiding. Supportive women also assisted. Smythe praised the goodness, care, and fidelity of the women, as well as their humane and benevolent treatment, finding feminine ingenuity never at a loss. The weather did not prove as cooperative. A rare, violent snowstorm also hindered the would-be escapees. On March the 1st, a 3-day snowstorm commenced, resulting in a 3-foot total snow accumulation, rather unusual for southern Delaware and the eastern shore counties of Maryland. As Smythe himself put it, this was very uncommon on the Delmarva Peninsula. The snow rendered escape all the more difficult, given that anyone could, rather obviously, detect footprints in the snow, not to mention hazardous travel conditions as well. And they didn't have the Delta salt trucks back then. Smythe, Manlove, and 9 other refugees were desperate. They considered options such as crossing the Delaware Bay, escaping by land through the Jerseys, or escaping by a dugout canoe along the treacherous Jersey shore, navigating by canoe from Cape May all the way up to New York. A more realistic and safer possibility emerged on March the 11th. 2 vessels of the Royal Navy, 2 lofty ships, and a sloop standing in the Cape Henlopen that is, presented a better option, both in terms of evading capture and safety on the seas. Even so, the 12 refugees, and there were 12 of them all told, still confronted a difficult task. They acquired that dugout canoe, carved from the trunk of a single tree. In that vessel, they had to journey from their hideout near Rehoboth Bay, 6 miles to the Indian River, 4 miles over the bar to the mouth, somewhere around the inlet, and 18 miles up the open Atlantic Ocean. And the area we're talking about here is probably somewhere in what today is Delaware Seashore State Park. And surely back in this point in time, they didn't have the wonderful amenities they have at the state park. Indeed, this is kind of a side point, but I've always been happy that about half of Delaware's coastline is state park land and thus spared from the never-ending line of high-rises and other such locations. But now they're in Delaware Seashore State Park, long of course before it became a state park, and certainly right along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean during what surely was a nor'easter. And how do you get from the Delaware coast up to those British vessels up in the area between Capes May and Henlopen? When the Loyalists finally made their escape on the night of March 11th, the dangerous bar at the mouth of the Indian River added to the danger. High breakers, another impending storm, and darkness combined to make a perilous effort even more so. The breakers had really a dreadful appearance. Everyone but Smythe himself wished to abandon the effort and return to their hideout near Rehoboth Bay. As the de facto captain, Smythe refused to turn back. He steered the vessel, that is the canoe, in the midst of the breakers and crossed out into the open Atlantic. A strong ebb tide carried them out of the sight of land, but somehow they managed to steer back toward Cape Henlopen, toward the lighthouse at Cape Henlopen, the one that collapsed in the 1920s. And the entire voyage was something like 18 to 20 miles from the Indian River. Smythe again had to dissuade his passengers from a return to the Indian River, warning that if they went back ashore, the breakers would destroy the canoe, which had somehow, maybe miraculously, had managed to survive. With nothing but death on all sides and a violent squall in progress, the men persisted and finally doubled around Cape Henlopen, but they did not see the British ships in the what today we call the Lewis Breakwater. They reached land near Lewis at 3 a.m. in the morning, within 300 yards of a rebel guard, depriving them of the pleasure of a fire for warmth. Captain Collick, one of the escapees who evidently had some connections in the area, went to the Henlopen lighthouse to inquire about the 3 British vessels, one of which had stood out to sea while the other 2 were off the lighthouse abreast of the Cape. 2 hours later, Smythe, Manlove, Robinson, and the others left the hostile shore and once more launched out into the Atlantic, sailing into a prodigious, heavy, thick fog. Somehow they discovered the looming of a ship at a great distance, rowed toward it, guided by a small pocket compass. Their hands blistering and bleeding from the rowing, they did make contact with the British man-of-war Preston. The British captain, Captain Hotham, and his officers rescued the refugees and gave them a hospitable welcome, but they lost their canoe in another sudden and violent squall. Boaz Manlove was finally on his way to British-occupied New York. When the British had occupied Philadelphia after the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th, 1777, Manlove and Robinson had come down from the occupied American capital of New York to Philadelphia. The previous fall, Robinson had suggested that Manlove and others who had suffered from patriot activity might lend support to the reassertion of British authority, not only in Philadelphia, but across the mid-Atlantic, almost said colonies, but now states. The British had also captured Delaware's first president, John McKinley, often accused of having Loyalist sympathies. Held by the British in Philadelphia, McKinley had a reunion of sorts with his 2 erstwhile Assembly colleagues from Sussex County. How friendly it was, we really don't know. Thomas McCain and George Reed expressed alarm about all of this, seeing no good emerging from this reunion. February 12, 1778, McCain remarked that McKinley had lodged at the widow Jenkins, along with his old friends Robinson and Manlove, and seemed very happy. Less than a month later, Caesar Rodney wrote McCain, noting that McKinley lodges with his old friends Robinson and Manlove, and that he seems perfectly satisfied. As Manlove did the bidding of the British, the legislature of Delaware debated that bill to deal with the state's Loyalist population. In the annual legislative elections of October 1770, as I pointed out, 1777, as I pointed out in my discussion at Peery, supporters of American independence had regained control of Delaware's assembly, and in 1778, actually enacted on June 26, 1778, they passed that Act of Free Pardon and Oblivion. As I mentioned before, 46 Loyalists were totally exempted from any type of pardon whatsoever, and one of those 46 Loyalists was none other than Boaz Manlove. Levin Derrickson, who, as we pointed out, had been appointed commissioner for the sale of forfeited estates in Sussex County, had the task of disposing of Boaz Manlove's property. And on September 23rd, 1778, he sold 113 acres of land held by Manlove to Manlove's old political adversary, John Clowes. Derrickson also sold land to another patriot named Elijah Nelson, and even more to Isaac Draper. And of course, having sold this property, Derrickson had to render an account of it as well, in not only real property, but personal property. And we know from this account that Boaz Manlove enslaved 5 individuals, a woman with 2 young children and 2 boys, both of whom were sold as well. But after the sale of the property, we see a bit of maybe compassion, sympathy, maybe a movement in the direction of reconciliation. John Clowes, who had purchased 113 acres of Manlove's property, not too long after the purchase, sold it to a woman named Bridget Manlove. Again, I have no documentation here, but it's, I would say, 99% certain that Bridget Manlove was the wife of Boaz. When Boaz fled Sussex County, he left his wife and his children behind. But on October 6, 1778, Clowes signed a deed conveying that land, part of Boaz Manlove's estate, to Boaz Manlove's presumed wife. So the rest of the property was, as I said, to Isaac Draper. And getting back to Bridget Manlove, unfortunately, Bridget Manlove did not live too long after acquiring her husband's property. On December 11th, 1785, Boaz Burroughs, who was administrator of Bridget Manlove's estate, valued it at only 74 pounds, fairly small valuation by the terms of that day. Even so, at her death, Bridget Manlove still owned a few trappings of wealth: a desk, a cupboard, a large looking glass, and a tea table. Even so, her personal estate was insufficient to pay the debts that were allegedly due to it. So years later, a protracted case in Chancery Court would begin, and the matter finally wasn't resolved until 1804. But we have still left unanswered what happened to Boaz Manlove himself. And the answer to that question is an honest, I don't know. Boaz Manlove disappears from the records after that brief sojourn in Philadelphia, after he presumably with Thomas Robinson got together with their old buddy, John McKinley, but after that I have been unable to find any record relating to Boaz Manlove. We can only assume that he died in British-occupied New York, but no records have emerged of when, where, or how. But even so, looking at Boaz Manlove's career, his loyalism reflected the sentiments of many, probably most, of his Sussex County constituents. Those sentiments put severe stress on the government of the newly independent Delaware state. And although not the site of any military engagement during the American War for Independence, Sussex County was, even so, the scene of considerable strife. Authorities in Delaware had to concern themselves with strife within the state, perhaps as much as they had to concern themselves with strife against the British. Conflict had personal as well as political ramifications as well. Boaz Manlove fled the state rather than face charges of treason, as I mentioned, leaving his wife and kids behind as well. And Bridget Manlove, her family members who remained in Delaware, of course, faced uncertainty, hardship, but of course that's always part of the civilian experience in wartime. In the end, however, some consideration shown Bridget Manlove by her husband's political opponent, maybe his number one opponent, John Clowes, set forth the possibility that time might well heal at least some of the wounds of the war. Thank you. Any questions? Sir?
You and I were talking before about Ken Burns' features on the Revolution. One of his main points is that the Revolutionary War was essentially a civil war, and that in the southern colonies, particularly Georgia and South Carolina, it may often have been that the majority of people fighting with the British were Americans. Now, that sort of reflects some of what you have talked about, I think.
Yes, it does. And I wouldn't call it entirely a civil war. It was a conflict between the new United States and the British, but the fact that there were many people in the new United States who were loyal to the British, in that sense, did make it a civil war, at least in a partial sense. Even though there were no open hostilities in Sussex County, there was always the potential for that to happen. just as it happened in the Southern campaign of roughly 1778 till the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Do we know what happened to any of the Manlove children later?
Okay, we must assume that they remained here in the new state of Delaware. I've looked at census records going into the early 1800s, and for example, there is a Boaz Manlove who was in the militia during the War of 1812, and I think it's a solidly safe assumption to assume that he was a descendant of Boaz the Loyalist, or Uncle Boaz, as I sometimes call him. But again, there's maybe not the proof that you might need, or that many genealogists are searching for, but I'll just say preponderance of evidence, I'll put it that way.
I just wanted to make a note that I do know of a William Manlove in Elkton, Maryland. So there are some Manloves up in Elk Creek area.
Oh yes, my grandmother, who was born in Warwick, Maryland, just a few miles west of Middletown, was a Manlove as well, and the William of Elkton is a fairly close cousin. Indeed, there was one of them who served for a number of years as one of the Cecil County Commissioners.
That's correct, he ran for District 36 Congression in 2010.
Okay. I'm not that familiar with Maryland politics, but I know that Bill Manlove was a county commissioner, and he might have well run for the House of Delegates as well.
You mentioned that Peery eventually had 1,000 acres that he owned, something like that.
Yeah, it was 1,300 as I recall.
So what did one do with 1,300 acres in those days?
Well, farming, he owned that sawmill, and he probably cut timber for his sawmill from parts of that land.
How many acres could a farmer farm? I mean, they had, it was all, nothing was mechanized.
Well, a small farmer, surely nothing close to 1,300 acres, but we in Peery, pardon?
A couple hundred would be a lot.
Oh, yes, yes. But William Peery, of course, owned enslaved labor, and he probably had tenant farmers as well, of his position. So I would say between tenant farmers and the people he enslaved, that would have been his means of, and like I said too, he probably kept some of that land in woodland to provide timber for his sawmill.
Do we know what the social interaction was between the Tories and rebels, I guess you would want to call them, the Sussex County, as far as business and social interaction would be on a daily basis during that period of time? I mean, did they literally walk on the opposite side of the street from each other, or was it a more congenial relationship between?
I would say before 1775, they were probably oftentimes good friends. If not good friends, they were oftentimes business associates, and as to whether they would cross the street to avoid greeting one another after 1776, well, that might well have happened. I think the possibility is nearly certain that they had a lot of business relationships before the support of or opposition to independence just drove them apart. Any other questions? Well, if not, I would like to thank you for your time and attention this morning, and weather conditions might be getting better, but even so, drive safely when you're on your way home. So thank you very much, and happy semi-quincentennial, and even closer to that, have a happy holiday season as well. So thank you.